The first thing Elias Voss ever said about the anomaly, he said to nobody. He was alone in the observation room, had been alone for most of the last 31 years, and the word came out as a whisper directed at the brass housing of the Coude refractor, which did not respond because it was a telescope and not a person. There, he said. The projected disk of the sun lay on the white paper circle pinned to the drawing board, a soft amber pool of light roughly the diameter of a dinner plate. He had been staring at it every clear morning since 1991. He knew its geography the way a shepherd knows a hillside. Every familiar dark cluster, every trailing penumbra, the way a large group tended to migrate across the face in 12 days, and vanish around the western limb only to reappear, slightly changed, 2 weeks later from the east. He knew how sunspots were supposed to look. This one did not look like that. It was not the size of it, though the size was wrong. It was not the shape, though the shape was wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up under his collar. It was the edge. The edge of a sunspot, any sunspot, is a soft and smudged border between the dark umbra and the surrounding photosphere. A penumbra, a graded zone of cooling gas, gradual as a bruise fading at the margins. The edge of this thing was sharp. It was geometrically, impossibly sharp, like someone had cut it with a blade. Elias set down his pencil. He pressed his hands flat on the drawing board on either side of the paper circle. He looked at the anomaly for a long time. Then he picked up the pencil again and began to draw it, carefully and precisely, exactly as it appeared, because that was what he did. He had been doing it every morning since 1991. His predecessor, old Sergio Cortesi, had been doing it every morning since 1957. Between them, they had produced over 22,000 drawings. The wall behind him was lined with archive binders, gray spines, each labeled by year, stretching the full length of the room. They constituted the longest continuous hand-drawn record of the solar surface in human history. When the space agencies wanted to correlate old data, they came to this room. When the solar physicists needed a spaceline that predated satellites, they called this number. Elias finished the drawing. He dated it, logged the time, noted the seeing conditions. Good, 4 out of 5. The air above the Swiss lake country, steady and clear this particular October morning, and he filed it. He sat for a moment looking at what he had filed it between. Yesterday's drawing to the left, and the drawing from 6 months ago on his right. He had pulled the old one for comparison, because something about the new anomaly nagged at him. He looked at the one from 6 months ago. There it was, smaller, less defined at the edges, but the same unusual sharpness, in the same relative position on the solar disk. He pulled more binders. He spent the rest of the morning doing what his entire career had prepared him to do. He looked at things very carefully for a very long time, and he wrote down what he saw. By noon, he had found 6 previous instances. The earliest was from 2018. Each instance, a sharply bounded dark feature in the lower right solar quadrant, consistently positioned, recurring every 4 to 7 months, growing larger and more defined with each appearance. He laid the drawings out along the table in sequence. The progression was unmistakable. Whatever this was, it had been announcing itself quietly for 5 years, and he had cataloged every announcement without recognizing the pattern because the pattern only made sense when you laid them all out together, and there had never been a reason to lay them all out together before. He ate his lunch at his desk, rye bread and cheese from the village below, coffee from the thermos his wife Marta had handed him at the door that morning without looking up from her own reading. 31 years she had handed him a thermos every morning without looking up from her reading. He had never felt this was a lack of love. It was, in fact, a precise expression of love, the kind that doesn't require performance. She knew where he was going and what he would do there, and that it mattered. And the thermos was her acknowledgement of all 3 facts. He drank the coffee. He looked at 6 years of drawings laid out in sequence on the table. He thought about who to call. The obvious answer was the CIDC in Brussels, the Solar Influences Data Analysis Center, who received his data every day and had been doing so for 30 years. He had a contact there, a young Belgian woman named Dr. Ankie Verhagen, brisk and thorough, who would listen carefully and ask good questions. He almost called her. Then he looked at the drawings again, really looked at the sequence of them, the progression, the growing sharpness of that edge, and he decided to wait one more day and take one more observation first. He was there the next morning at 6:45, which was early even for him. The sky was still dark over the lake. He climbed the stairs to the observation room, unlocked the dome shutter, and waited for the sun. It came up above the ridge of Monte Gambarogno at 7:22, a red flat disk swimming in the haze above the peaks. He did not attempt observations through haze. He waited. By 8, the air had cleared sufficiently. He opened the shutter the rest of the way. adjusted the refractor, and let the sun's image fall onto the paper. The anomaly was there. It was larger. It was also now clearly not alone. There was a second feature adjacent to it, smaller, the same impossibly sharp edge, separated from the first by a narrow corridor of bright photosphere. Two features. The corridor between them was straight. Elias sat back from the drawing board. He was 63 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in this room, or rather, in a version of this room, because he had started as Sergio Cortesi's junior observer in 1989, spending his first 2 years learning the instrument and learning Sergio's system of notation before Sergio retired, and he had taken over. He had sat in this chair through 11 solar cycles. He had watched the sun turn through its rhythms, the 11-year heartbeat of maximum and minimum activity, the emergence and decay of active regions, the huge, magnificent, sweeping arcs of coronal mass ejections that bloomed from the limb on the best days and sent shudders through Earth's magnetic field that you could see in compass needles and aurora, reports from Norway and the color of the sky above the high Alps. He was not by any measure a dramatic man. He was methodical. He was patient. He was constitutionally incapable of sensationalism, which was probably why this job had suited him for 3 decades. He looked at two geometrically edged features on the face of the sun, separated by a straight corridor, and he said very quietly, "That is not natural." Then he drew them, dated the drawing, logged it, and called Brussels, doctor. Anki Verhey drove up from the train station in a rented Fiat at 2 in the afternoon with a laptop bag and a look on her face that's Elias recognized, the expression of a scientist who has been told something alarming by telephone and has spent 6 hours convincing herself. The alarm is premature. She was younger than he had expected from her voice, which was composed and unhurried on the phone. In person, she was 30-something, dark-haired, compact, and moved with the efficient impatience of someone who was always calculating how much time things took. She sat at his table and he laid the drawings out for her. She did not say anything for 8 minutes. He knew because he was watching the clock on the wall, the old electric clock, with the cream face and the red sweep hand that had hung in this room since 1969 and kept nearly perfect time. "When did you first notice the sharp boundary?" she said finally. "This week. But when I looked back," he gestured at the sequence. "That's the earliest." He pointed to the 2018 drawing. She picked it up, held it close, set it down, picked up the most recent one. The difference between them was immediately, visibly significant, even to a non-specialist. "You've been cataloging these for 5 years without flagging them." "I flagged them as unusual morphology each time," he said. Without defensiveness, it was simply true. But the sharp boundary I attributed to instrument artifacts. The progression that I only saw yesterday when I laid them in sequence. She nodded slowly. "Who else have you told?" "You." She looked at him. "Just me. Just you." She closed her laptop. This was a gesture Elias found interesting. She had opened it when she arrived and had not typed a single thing, and now she was closing it. "I need to make some calls," she said. "Before we say anything to anyone else. Can I stay through tomorrow's observation?" "The spare room at the house is empty," he said. "Marta makes eggs." She almost smiled. "Okay." She made her calls outside, walking in small circles in the gravel courtyard between the observatory building and the equipment shed. He watched her through the window without meaning to. She was on the phone for a long time, much longer than he would have expected for the kind of preliminary, cautious conversation a careful scientist would have. She was animated in a way he had not seen in the meeting room. Her free hand moved. At one point, she stopped walking and stood very still with her head down listening, and then she started walking again faster. He made dinner. He was a decent cook. Marta was better, but she was in Bellinzona visiting her sister, so he made pasta with the mountain herbs that grew in the window box and opened a half bottle of the Merlot from the village co-op. When Aunt came inside, she accepted the wine without comment and sat at the table and did not immediately speak. "You reached someone," Elias said. "Several someones." She turned the glass in her hands. The wine was a deep red, almost black in the lamplight. "There's a team at the Max Planck Institute for Solar System Research that's been tracking anomalous deep layer signatures using heliosismology data. They haven't published. They've been uncertain about what they were seeing." She paused. "They're not uncertain anymore." Elias set down his fork. "The heliosismology data shows coherent, organized acoustic shadowing beneath the visible anomaly," she said. "Not geological, not magnetic field structures, organized." The Max Planck team's lead called it architecturally consistent internal geometry. Those are the words he used, architecturally consistent. The electric clock swept its red hand. Somewhere on the lake below, a boat's horn sounded, muffled by distance and autumn fog. How long have they had this data? Elias asked. The clear signatures go back about 14 months. The ambiguous signatures longer. She finally drank her wine. They were waiting because they didn't believe it. They needed an independent surface observation that correlated spatially and temporally. She looked at him. You just gave them that. Elias thought about the 22,000 drawings in the binders on the wall. He thought about Sergio Cortesi, who had spent 64 years looking at the sun with the faith of a monk, waiting for his god to answer. He thought about the answer arriving 60 years later to a different man, in the form of something with a sharp edge that should not exist. Something is inside the sun, he said. Anki did not correct him. The next several weeks had a quality he would later try to describe to his daughter and fail, a quality of unreality that was not panic, exactly, but was a kind of cognitive vertigo, as if the ground had shifted slightly and he was walking normally, but all his sense of level had been recalibrated without his permission. People came to the observatory, first from Max Planck, then from ETH Zurich, then 3 people from an agency with a 2-letter acronym he was asked not to write down. They were not rude. They were, in fact, very careful with him. Careful in the way you are careful with someone who is holding something fragile and essential. They sat at his table, in his observation room, and they looked at his drawings and they asked him questions that showed they had studied the methodology deeply before arriving. He kept doing the observations. Every clear morning he was there at the instrument, letting the sun fall onto the paper, tracing what he saw. It was the one thing that felt solid. The other things, the meetings, the video calls that had begun happening on a laptop Anki had left with him, the conversations in which people spoke in carefully flattened tones about implications and assets and coordinated response, those had an unreal quality. The drawing was real. His pencil on the paper was real. The sharp-edged feature growing on the face of the sun was real. By December, it was large enough to be visible in amateur equipment. The first online reports appeared. Astronomy forums, social media posts from backyard observers who had caught something unusual in their solar filters, cautiously worded questions about whether this was a known phenomenon. The agencies handled this, or tried to. There was a brief and not entirely convincing official statement about an unusually large and morphologically distinct sunspot group, consistent with the current stage of the solar cycle. Elias read the statement. He thought it was about 40% accurate, which was better than nothing. He did not say this to anyone. He also did not say, to anyone outside the circle of people he had been brought into, that the feature had by December resolved into a distinct and unmistakable pattern of concentric geometric forms. Rings within rings, precisely spaced, each with that same impossibly clean edge. It had no analog anywhere in the 22,000 drawing archive. It had no analog anywhere in the literature. He had searched, so had a dozen other people with far more sophisticated tools than his. Whatever this was, it had not been seen before, or rather it had been building for at least 5 years, incrementally, in plain sight, and nobody had put the drawings in sequence and looked. He found himself returning, in the evenings, to the earliest drawing in the sequence, the 2018 one, the first faint ghost of it. A single small feature, sharp-edged, lower right quadrant. He had made a note in the margin of the log that day. Unusual boundary morphology, possible projection artifact, will monitor. He had monitored. He had accumulated 5 more years of data without understanding what he was accumulating. He did not feel stupid. He felt, more precisely, the way a person feels when they discover that a letter they were keeping in a drawer without opening it contained instructions they needed years ago, not stupid, merely late, and wondering in a way that was becoming habitual whether late was going to matter. In January, the circle of people with genuine information about what was happening became larger, necessarily, because the feature was now visible in standard amateur solar equipment on any clear day, and the official statements were becoming obviously inadequate. There was a meeting in Geneva. Elias was not at this meeting. He heard about it afterward from Anka, at which a decision was made that the information would be released in structured stages, beginning with the acknowledgement that anomalous organized structures had been detected in association with the observed solar surface features, and that these were under study by an international scientific consortium. The night after this meeting, Anki called him. Not a video call, just the phone, late, after 10. They're going to make the announcement in phases, she said. The first phase goes out Friday. She paused. The actual content of the Max Planck heliosomology data will not be in phase 1. When will it be? Silence on the line. He listened to the sound of somewhere Brussels, a distant tram, the particular quality of acoustic emptiness in a room where someone is not moving. I don't know, she said. They're still working on the parallel problem. Which parallel problem? Whether there's a way to communicate with it. Another pause. Whether it has already been communicating, and we haven't recognized it as communication. Elias sat in his kitchen. The thermos from that morning was on the table empty. Marta had come back from her sister's in November and had been making the thermos every morning without comment, because she was Marta, and that was how she operated. He had told her, in December, what was actually happening. She had listened completely, without interrupting, and then she had gone back to her book. And then at bedtime she had said, "It's been there for 60 years, you said." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then it's been patient. That's either a very good sign or a very bad one." He had no response to this that wasn't inadequate, so he said nothing, and she turned off her lamp. "Has it communicated?" he asked Anki. "There was a modulation event in early November," she said, "in the helioseismology data, a pattern, highly structured, roughly correlating with the resolution of those concentric features you identified, as if the visibility change was deliberate, as if it was." She stopped. "Showing itself," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "That's the word they keep coming back to. It was showing itself." He thought about that for a while after they hung up. He thought about the 6-year sequence of drawings, the incrementally growing, incrementally clarifying image, each drawing a step closer to legibility. He thought about a message written so slowly that its writer expected the recipient to accumulate the data over years rather than decode a single transmission. He thought about who would write a message that way, the kind of patience that required, the kind of certainty about the receiver's methodology, the assumption that the receiver would be paying attention consistently over years to the right instrument at the right place and would eventually notice. He thought about 22,000 drawings. He thought about Sergio Cortesi, who started this archive in 1957 and kept it for 64 years, with the faith of a monk to whom his own God never gave an answer. Maybe, Elias thought, the answer came, just not to Sergio, and maybe that was all right. The announcement in Phase 1 landed on a Friday in late January, and by Monday, the world had undergone one of those fundamental reorganizations of frame that happen rarely and leave permanent watermarks on time. You could always afterward tell whether you'd known someone before the announcement or after, because before people and after people had slightly different orientations toward certain categories of reality. Elias did not watch the news coverage. He had never been someone who watched news coverage even before there was anything particular to cover. He read 2 articles carefully and then felt he had an adequate picture. He continued his observations. He noted, in his log, that the feature was now stable, no longer growing. The concentric rings were fully resolved and steady. Whatever the process of reveal had been, it appeared to be complete. The thing in the sun had finished showing itself. He waited. The second communication event happened in February. He was not the one who detected it. That was the Max Planck team, whose helioseismology apparatus was incomparably more sensitive than anything in his room. But they called him, at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, because the spatial correlation in the deep structure data pointed exactly to the surface coordinates he had been charting since 2018, and they wanted his drawings of the previous 3 days for comparison. He emailed them. He had everything organized by date. It took him 4 minutes. The second communication event was, according to the people analyzing it, a response. To what it was a response, none of them were certain. There had been no deliberate transmission from Earth, which meant it was a response to something Earth had done without meaning it as a message, some pattern of activity that the entity inside the sun had interpreted as signal. The analysis teams argued about this for weeks. What activity, what pattern, radio emissions? Electromagnetic signatures from the technological civilization it had been observing? The sheer accumulated presence of human technology spreading outward through the solar system for the past 100 years? Or something else, something older. The person who first suggested older was a 78-year-old radio astronomer named Dr. Yusuf Al-Mansouri, who had been one of SETI's original founding scientists and who still came to the office every day in Palo Alto, despite being retired for 12 years, because he had nowhere better to be and the coffee was acceptable. He had been working, during those 12 years, on a project nobody had funded because nobody had thought it was relevant, a reanalysis of mid-century solar observation archives, looking for any structured anomalies in the pre-satellite era sunspot record. He had found 7. The earliest was from 1924. They were all in the same solar quadrant. They were all small, ambiguous, and easily explainable as optical artifacts or unusual active region morphology. And when you laid them in sequence alongside Elias's 2018 to 2024 drawings, the progression made a kind of sense that made Yusuf's old bones ache. It had been watching far longer than 5 years. He brought his reanalysis to Geneva in March. Elias was in the room this time, because by March Elias was at every significant meeting, not because he had pushed for inclusion, but because the people running the analysis had gradually come to understand that he was one of the few people in the world who had the whole picture assembled in 3 dimensions, the archive of drawings, the specific instrument, and 31 years of unbroken personal experience with the data. He was the continuity. He was the institutional memory of the sun's surface behavior, and right now that memory was the most valuable single data set on Earth. He sat in the back of the room and watched Yusuf al-Manzouri present his 1924 data with the focused calm of a very old man presenting the conclusion of a life's work. The room was silent. Not the silence of polite attention, but the silence of 200 people recalibrating something fundamental, based on the temporal pattern, Yusuf said, pausing to drink from a glass of water with hands that shook slightly but without apology, and the consistent spatial positioning. My best estimate is that organized anomalous signatures in the sunspot record begin no later than approximately 1890 and possibly significantly earlier. Prior to 1890, the observational archive becomes too sparse and methodologically inconsistent for confident analysis. But the trajectory, he brought up a slide, a simple graph, time on the horizontal axis, feature size and definition on the vertical. The curve was clear, long, slow, nearly flat for most of its length, then beginning to curve upward. The trajectory is consistent with an entity that arrived in the solar environment in the pre-industrial period and has been gradually increasing its surface expression over the past century or so. The acceleration in signature strength correlates, not perfectly, but meaningfully, with the growth of Earth's electromagnetic output. Someone in the middle of the room said, "It heard us." Yusuf looked in the direction of the voice. "That would be my inference, yes," he said. "It heard us." And over the course of approximately a century, it has been turning around to look. The room was very quiet. Elias, in the back, was looking at a printed copy of his drawing from the most recent morning's observation. He looked at it for the rest of the presentation without looking up. After the session, he walked out into the corridor and stood at the window, looking down at the street below. Geneva gray and orderly in early March, the lake surface pewter-colored under cloud cover. He thought about 1890. He thought about what the Earth looked like from the solar environment in 1890. The first radio signals beginning to generate, the first electrical grids coming online, the particular electromagnetic fingerprint of a technological civilization announcing itself for the first time against the background noise of a biosphere, a knock at the door, an arrival, and then a century of patient waiting while the visitor oriented itself and the signal grew clearer and the picture assembled itself, drawing by careful drawing into something that could be shown. In April, the third communication event was different in character from the first two. The first had been a showing, a deliberate increase in surface visibility, a clarification of signature that said, "Here, look here." The second had been a response, a modulation that corresponded in timing to something Earth civilization had done, an acknowledgement of detection. The third was an instruction. That was the word the analysis team used, eventually, after considerable debate. Instruction. It was patterned in a way that correlated with mathematical structures detectable across multiple frequency simultaneously. Deep layer acoustic, surface magnetic, and a narrow band of electromagnetic emission that had been previously attributed to an unusual coronal loop structure and dismissed. Taken together, these three simultaneous channels carried a message that could be translated, after months of painstaking work, into something roughly equivalent to a set of coordinates, not spatial coordinates. Or not only spatial, the coordinates described a configuration, an arrangement of specific frequencies, specific timing intervals, specific phase relationships that the analysis teams eventually concluded was a description of how to receive something. A tuning key, instructions for an antenna setting that Earth's existing radio infrastructure, if coordinated globally, could achieve. The coordination required to achieve it was extraordinary. It required the simultaneous cooperation of every major radio telescope on the planet and a significant portion of global telecommunications infrastructure. It required the agreement of governments that were not historically in the habit of agreements of this kind. It required, in the bluntest terms, a degree of collective human action for a shared, non-coercive purpose that had not been achieved before in the species' history. It took 11 months. Elias spent those 11 months in the observation room, continuing to do what he had always done. Every morning that was clear, he was at the instrument. Every morning he made his drawing, logged it, dated it, filed it. The feature on the sun's face remained stable, no longer growing, no longer modulating, just present, patient, waiting for the answer that was being assembled at glacial speed by a species that had needed over a century to notice it was there and was now, in its characteristically messy and argumentative fashion, trying to answer back. People occasionally asked him what he thought they would receive when the global antenna array finally achieved its configuration. He always answered the same way. He didn't know, and he had learned to be comfortable with the amount of things he didn't know because 31 years of looking at the sun had given him a profound respect for how much of any phenomenon consists of things that are simply not visible from your current position. He meant this non-dramatically. It was the literal truth of observational science. You see what your instrument can see, and you draw what you see, and you are careful to note the limitations of both. The existence of things beyond your instrument's range is not a mystery or a threat. It is simply the condition of any bounded observation. You work with what you have. What he had was 23,000 drawings, a well-calibrated refractor, and the patience his predecessor had modeled for him across 59 years of quiet, consistent, faithful work. It turned out, the right preparation. The global array achieved configuration on a Thursday in March, 14 months after the third communication event, in the early hours of the morning European time. Elias was asleep. Marta was asleep. The world, on the whole, was not. There were people awake in every time zone, watching, because the configuration timing had been coordinated and announced, and there was an entire planet that had been waiting. He was woken at 4:30 by the phone. It was Anki. It's transmitting, she said. He sat up. Now. Since approximately 3:15. The array has been receiving for over an hour. She stopped. He heard her breathing. Elias, it's comprehensive. It's an enormous amount of data. Multiple simultaneous encoded channels. We're going to be decades parsing it. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The lake was invisible below the windows, but he knew it was there. The way he always knew the sun was there even on the days when the clouds prevented observation. What does the analysis team think it is? Another pause. They're calling it a library, she said, for lack of a better word. A library and something like a letter. A record and a communication, both at once. Their early analysis suggests. Her voice changed slightly, a shift he couldn't quite characterize. Not distress. Something older than distress. It's been here for a very long time, Elias. The data suggests a presence in the solar environment going back much further than 1890. Much further than any century we can document. And it's been collecting. Observing. It watched everything. Every phase of the biosphere. The whole history of complex life on Earth, from 150 million kilometers away, watching the electromagnetic signature of a living planet and recording it. She paused. And then something in the last 150 years changed enough that it began, gradually, to turn around, to introduce itself. Elias looked at the dark window. Beyond it, the sky over Monte Gambarogno was still night black, a couple hours from dawn. He would be up there at the observatory in a few hours. He would open the dome shutter and let the sun in and lay the paper on the drawing board and, look, a letter, he said. That's the best approximation right now. A very, very long letter. The kind you write when you've been watching someone your whole life and you finally decide it's time to say hello. He thought about the archive wall. Gray binders, labeled by year, the whole long record of someone paying attention. He thought about Sergio Cortesi, who started the record in 1957 and continued it for 64 years and never received an answer, but whose record, whose particular meticulous handmade record, had become part of the chain of detection that led here. Every morning, every clear morning, the projection disc on the paper, the careful pencil line. Should I come to Geneva? He said. Not yet, she said. Right now, we just need you to keep doing what you do. The observation record is, we need the continuity. We need someone at the instrument. He almost laughed. He contained it. All right. Ilias, she said, you understand that this would not have happened without your archive, without the sequence, without someone who had been paying attention consistently enough to recognize the pattern in the data. Sergio started the archive, he said. Sergio started it, she agreed, but you ran it for 31 years without interruption, and you noticed. After they hung up, he sat in the dark for a while. Marta's breathing was steady beside him. He did not wake her. There would be time. Outside, below the fog-covered lake, beyond the ridge of Monte Gambarogno, 150 million kilometers away, in a direction that was currently, below the horizon, the sun was climbing toward another morning. Inside it, or near it, or woven into its deep magnetic structure, in some way that the analysis teams were still arguing about, something waited with a patience so vast that a human lifetime was a brief afternoon to it, and had been waiting for a long time and had finally, after a century of watching the lights come on across a small planet, decided to knock. The data stream continued for 19 days. Not the initial burst, that lasted approximately 4 hours before tapering, but the total transmission, which cycled through multiple compression formats and required the global array to maintain its configuration at intervals across the 19-day period to receive what appeared to be error correction and supplementary data packets. The analysis teams worked in shifts. They slept on cots in the facilities and ate at their workstations and developed a strange collective intimacy, the way people do when they are trapped together by something enormous. Elias kept his schedule. He was at the observatory at dawn. He made his drawings. He filed them. He drank Marta's thermos coffee and ate his rye bread at the table in the observation room. And in the evenings, he took calls from Anki and occasionally from others. The picture that assembled, slowly, over those 19 days and the months of analysis that followed it, was this. The entity in the sun was old in a way that made geological time feel recent. It had not originated in the solar system. It had arrived here. The data contained something that could be interpreted as a record of its arrival, though the time period was so distant that the numbers required were genuinely outside ordinary human intuition, and it had settled into the deep structure of the sun the way certain organisms settle into apparently inhospitable environments and make them home. It was not biological in any sense that corresponded to Earth biology. It was not electronic or mechanical in any sense that corresponded to Earth technology. It was something else, something that worked with energy and structure at scales that had no Earth analog, and that had found the interior of a medium-sized G-type star to be a comfortable enough environment. It was not alone of its kind, or it had not been once. The letter, to whatever degree the translations were accurate, contained references to others, to a larger context from which it had become separated, across a distance and a duration, that the analysis teams were reluctant to put specific numbers on. Because the specific numbers were genuinely unnerving. It was old, it was alone, and it had spent an enormous period of time moving through the galaxy before arriving in this solar system, and then an enormous further period watching this particular small planet do something unexpected. Develop a technological civilization, generate an electromagnetic presence, and eventually look back. This last part, the looking back. Elias had a long phone conversation with Yusuf al-Manzouri in late May, the night before Yusuf presented his expanded analysis to the Geneva Consortium. Yusuf was in Palo Alto. It was late there. He sounded tired in the specific way of someone who has been doing something important for so long that the importance has become inseparable from the exhaustion. It was waiting for the right kind of looking, Yusuf said. That's what I keep coming back to. It wasn't waiting for us to develop specific technologies. It was waiting for us to develop the habit of consistent observation. The archive wasn't just a data record. It was, in some sense, I don't know how to formalize, it was proof of a certain quality of attention, sustained, patient, interested in small incremental changes over long periods of time. That's not a trivial achievement for a short-lived species. Sergio started it 67 years before the entity showed itself clearly, Elias said. And someone had to still be there to recognize it when it did, Yusuf said. The chain couldn't have a break. If the archive had been interrupted, if there had been a gap in the record, the pattern might not have been detectable. Probably wouldn't have been. He paused. Do you know what the Locarno record is in terms of its place in the total body of solar observation? It's the longest continuously maintained hand-drawn solar surface record by a single institutional observer in human history. Not longest in total, it's not the longest total, but longest continuous, without interruption. That is an extraordinary thing. Elias looked at the binders. He had stopped counting them in his head years ago. They were just the wall, the long gray wall, the accumulated weight of attention. Sergio used to say, he said, that the sun is the kind of god who doesn't explain himself. You just have to keep watching. Silence on the line from Palo Alto. That sounds about right, Yusuf said quietly. There was a period, running roughly from late summer to midwinter of that year, during which the world did something that surprised Elias. Given everything he knew about the world, it was, in some basic register, decent about it. Not uniformly, not without conflict. There were governments that behaved badly, and factions that responded to the arrival of alien contact with the full range of pathologies that might be predicted. There were people who decided this meant the end of something, and people who decided it meant the beginning of something, and people who decided it meant God was speaking, and people who decided it meant there was no God, and people who decided none of those things but were simply frightened in the old mammalian way, the wordless way, the way that didn't need an argument. But underneath all of that, what Elias observed, from his vantage point at the edge of events, the observer at the instrument, not the one in the room where decisions were made, was something he had not predicted and found affecting. An enormous number of human beings, individually and without coordination, simply got quiet and looked up. They acquired solar filters and looked at the anomaly with amateur telescopes and binoculars and the special eclipse glasses that had been sold in enormous quantities around the world. They looked at the sun the way Sergio had looked at it for 64 years, with sustained, patient, wondering attention. The search volume data for how to observe sunspots peaked in July at a number that was, the analysis teams noted, unprecedented in the history of the metric. Everyone suddenly wanted to see what Sergio had been looking at. Elias found this moving in a way he couldn't entirely justify. It was not rational. The observers with their amateur telescopes and eclipse glasses were not adding to the scientific picture. Their data was not being collected or analyzed. But there was something about the gesture of it. The millions of people pointing an optical device at the sun and attempting to see that felt like the right response, the appropriate human response. Not panic, not war, not retreat. Observation. The species doing the thing that had gotten it into this situation in the first place, doing it more and doing it harder, as if the answer to finding out that you have been being watched is to look back. He thought about the chain of attention. Sergio in 1957, then the succession of observers, the unbroken daily record, the long wall of binders, then himself at the instrument every clear morning, drawing what he saw, noting what seemed unusual, filing it, doing it again tomorrow. Then the morning he laid 6 drawings in sequence and noticed the pattern. Then Anke's phone, then the Max Planck team, then Yusuf's reanalysis of the 1924 archive, then Geneva, then 11 months of global coordination for a radio array, then a 19-day data stream from inside the sun, a chain of attention. Each link unremarkable in isolation, a man at a telescope drawing spots on a piece of paper, and together something that could receive the attention of a solitary ancient entity that had been watching a living planet from 150 million kilometers away and waiting, with vast patience, for someone to look back with sufficient consistency and care. The day in October that the initial translation summary was released to the public, Elias drove down to Locarno village in the evening and bought a bottle of good wine, the kind he wouldn't normally buy, and brought it home to Marta, who accepted it without looking up from her book and then looked up. "Good news?" she said. "Something like that," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had of looking at him that required no additional commentary, the way that had been their whole long marriage, the patient look that said, "I hear you completely even when you don't say the thing." Then she set down her book and went to get the glasses. They released the first full structural summary of the translation in January of the following year, a year and a half after the initial detection announcement, 8 months after the end of the primary transmission. It was 97 pages of careful, heavily annotated scientific language with extensive footnotes explaining the degree of uncertainty in each interpreted passage. It was not a document for general reading. It was the work product of 312 scientists in 24 countries, representing a consensus of interpretation that had been argued, qualified, revised, and argued again for the better part of a year. Elias read the whole thing. He was one of very few non-specialist readers who did. It took him several weeks. He read sections of it in the evenings after the daily observations, cross-referencing the footnotes when the uncertainty qualifications became complex, building his own slow picture. What it said in its careful and qualified and footnoted way was approximately this. The entity had been present in the solar environment for a period of time that was difficult to render in ordinary terms, but could be roughly estimated at several billion years. It had arrived here as part of a larger movement or dispersal of similar entities, of which it was now apparently the last, or nearly the last, in this region of the galaxy. It had observed the formation and evolution of the solar system. It had observed, from its unique vantage, the emergence and development of life on the third planet. It had watched, across a period that corresponded to the entirety of Earth's complex multicellular life history, the slow unfolding of biological complexity, the great mass events that reset the board, the evolutionary experiments that failed, the ones that didn't, the particular experiment of about 600 million years ago that had eventually produced, after a chain of accidents and adaptations and extinctions that nobody had designed or intended, a species capable of building instruments that broadcast into space and eventually recognize something broadcasting back. It had been, in whatever sense the translations were accurate, alone for a very long time. The final section of the summary, the section that the footnotes acknowledged was most uncertain, most dependent on interpretive choices that might be wrong, most likely to require revision as the full translation progressed, was the section that addressed what the entity wanted, if want was the right word. The analysts were careful about want. They used phrases like communicative intent and apparent preference and inferred orientation. But reading through the careful language, Elias understood what it said. It wanted to have a conversation, not a brief one, a long one, the kind of conversation that proceeds at the pace of geological time, message, and response, cycling across decades, each exchange building on the last, a slow and patient dialogue between a species that had been paying attention for 67 years and a presence that had been paying attention for several billion, an exchange of records, an exchange of attention. It had chosen this species specifically from everything it had observed across the long sweep of this solar system's life, not randomly, not by default, because this was the species that had, among all the things it had tried and tried again and failed better, eventually developed the habit of setting up an instrument in a quiet room on a mountainside above a Swiss lake and looking every single clear morning at the same thing and writing down what it saw without interruption for longer than any other species in the history of this planet had maintained any continuous observational project. That was the message, or the core of it. That was why. In February, Elias went to Geneva for a meeting at which approximately 70 scientists and officials were present, discussing the question of response, how to reply, what to say, in what format. He sat at the back as usual. He had brought his thermos. He drank his coffee and listened to the discussion, which was vigorous and at times heated and was, he felt, covering important ground in the appropriate way, meaning many disagreements, no consensus yet, and nobody pretending otherwise. Near the end of the afternoon session, one of the senior analysts, a French astrophysicist who had been coordinating the translation effort, put up a slide that showed a simple timeline. On the left, 1957, first observation at Specula Solar. On the right, the current year, a straight horizontal line between them. And at certain points along the line, small dots marking the moments that the anomaly had appeared in the archive. The 2018 signal, the 2019 signal, the 2020, the clearer ones after that. Each dot representing a day when someone had been at the instrument and seen it and, crucially, recorded it, so that when the time came to lay them in sequence, the sequence was there. The response architecture we're proposing, the analyst said, is modeled on the method by which we detected the original communication. Slow accumulation, daily observation, a long, sustained, consistent signal rather than a single broadcast. We believe this is what the entity will recognize as a serious response, not a single reply, but the establishment of a practice, an ongoing reciprocal practice of attention. He looked at the room. This will take a very long time, he said. We are proposing an infrastructure that assumes multiple generations of human commitment to maintaining the practice. This is not a project that concludes in a human lifetime. We believe that's the point. In the back of the room, Elias thought about Sergio Cortesi, who had started the archive in 1957 and continued it until he retired in his late 80s and passed it to his successor, who had passed it to Elias, who had maintained it for 31 years and would eventually pass it to someone else. He thought about the gray binders on the wall. He thought about the quiet early mornings and the thermos, and the sun coming over the ridge, and the light falling on the paper, and the pencil in his hand, the slow, careful line. He thought, yes, that is how you do it. That is exactly how you do it. In March, which was early spring in Ticino, the almond trees on the slopes below the observatory beginning to blossom, the lake taking on a steely blue after the gray of winter, Elias had a visitor he had not expected, a man named Tobias Brandt, who worked for the Federal Council's new Office for Long-Duration Institutional Continuity, which was one of several agencies created in the past year to address exactly the kind of multi-generational problem Elias had been thinking about. He was younger than Elias expected, late 30s, maybe 40, with the particular combination of calm and alertness that Elias associated with people who had recently taken on very large and important responsibilities and were managing them by choosing not to think about how large and important they were. He wanted to talk about succession, not Elias's succession specifically, though they got to that. He wanted to understand the process, how the archive worked, how the observation practice had maintained continuity across the transition from Sergio to Elias, and across the years when both were present and the years when Sergio was retired and Elias was sole observer. He wanted to understand the institutional structure, what was formal, what was informal, what was documented, what was tacit knowledge that existed only in the observer's head. Elias walked him through all of it: the logbook system, the instrument calibration procedure, the drawing methodology, the way you oriented the paper circle to heliographic north, the specific graphite hardness that produced the best tonality in the projection drawing, the notation system for edge morphology, the standard codes for seeing quality. He showed him the binders. He showed him the calibration records. He showed him the small notebook he had kept since the early years, separate from the official log, in which he wrote observations that didn't fit neatly into the standard notation, interpretive notes, questions, things that nagged at him, things he wanted to come back to. Tobias Brandt took notes on all of it, not on a laptop, on paper, in a small notebook, with a precise and legible hand. Elias noticed this and approved of it without saying so. At the end of the afternoon, standing in the courtyard in the early spring sun, not looking at the sun, just standing in it, the particular warmth of early spring after a long Swiss winter, Tobias said, "Do you think about what it's like for it, the entity, all that time?" Elias considered this. "Sometimes," he said. "It's been watching this planet since before there were things with eyes on it," Tobias said. He shook his head. "I don't know what that is." "Lonely," Elias said. "Probably." Tobias looked at him. "Or maybe not," Elias said. "I don't know if it has loneliness in the sense we mean. But it's separated from all its kind. It's been in one place for a very long time, and then something started happening on the third planet that was new and interesting. And it waited and waited, and then someone started keeping records. And then someone noticed the records." He shrugged. "From where I'm standing, that sounds like the shape of a kind of loneliness that finds a kind of answer." The almond trees on the slope below were small with distance and white against the darker pines. The lake was blue and perfectly still. "We're going to need a lot of people who do what you do," Tobias said. "Steady people. People who can maintain a practice across decades without needing it to resolve into something. People who can be patient with a timescale that isn't human." "There are more of those people than you might think," Elias said. "They're just not usually doing things that matter this much." He went back into the observatory and climbed the stairs to the observation room. The afternoon light was wrong for solar observation. You needed the steady morning air, not the turbulent afternoon convection, but he went anyway, out of habit. He stood at the drawing board. He looked at the projection disc of the paper circle, blank and white, waiting for the morning. He looked at the binders on the wall. He looked at the meticulous notations in the logbook, dating back to 1957 in Sergio's careful handwriting, and continuing in his own 31 years of them, the long accumulated evidence of sustained attention. He thought about the letter inside the sun. He thought about a presence so old it had watched the formation of the solar system, watching a small rocky planet develop an atmosphere, and then oceans, and then something green, watching the green thing spread and change and produce, after an improbable series of accidents, creatures that eventually lit fires and then built instruments and then pointed those instruments at the sky and started asking questions, started looking up, with the particular urgent, wondering attention of a species that had just figured out there was something to look at. And then, after the fire and the instruments and the questions, after the particular electromagnetic noise of a technological civilization spreading outward from a small blue world, after all of that, one man in a quiet room on a mountainside every clear morning looking at the sun, drawing what he saw, dating it, logging it, filing it, coming back tomorrow, the thing that had been waiting for the right kind of attention, vast, patient, ancient, alone, had found it in the most human place imaginable. Not in a broadcast, not in a calculation, in an archive, in the long gray wall of binders, in the daily practice of someone who had decided, decades ago, that paying attention was enough of a reason to keep going, even when nobody gave an answer. He picked up a pencil, not to draw, there was nothing to draw, just to hold it, the familiar weight of it, the way it felt in his hand. After 3 decades of the same gesture, tomorrow morning he would be here at 6:45. He would wait for the sun. He would open the dome shutter and let the light in and place the paper on the board and look. He would draw what he saw. He would date it, log it, file it, and come back tomorrow. He did not know what the conversation with the entity inside the sun would look like in 20 years or 50, or in the centuries his successors would be responsible for. He did not know what they would learn. He did not know what would be exchanged, what records would pass in what directions, What questions might find answers at a pace no single human life was long enough to encompass? He knew what his job was. It was the same job it had always been. He set the pencil down on the edge of the drawing board, carefully, the way he had done 10,000 times before, so that it wouldn't roll. He turned off the light. He went down the stairs. Outside, the early spring evening was cool and smelled of the lake and the almond blossoms and the particular clean cold that comes off snow-covered mountains, even in the valley below them. He walked the path down toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see the lamp, and Marta in the lamp's light, and the shadow of her book held in both hands. He went inside. The sun was on the other side of the world, illuminating someone else's morning. Something moved in its deep structure, vast and patient and immeasurably old, turning its attention toward the third planet the way something enormous and slow turns. Not quickly, not with urgency, but with the steady settling weight of an intent that had been building for a very long time. Tomorrow morning it would be above the ridge of Monte Gambarogno by 7:22. He would be ready. 3 months after the initial translation summary was released, Elias received a letter. Not an email, a physical letter, handwritten, on paper so thin it was nearly translucent, addressed to him at the observatory in a script he didn't recognize as any Roman alphabet variant. It had been forwarded to him through the Federal Council's new coordination office, with a cover note explaining that it had been found in the second tranche of translated data, not a document, but embedded in the structural metadata of one of the encoded channels, as if left in a margin or a footnote. The translators had taken 6 weeks to decode it and had attached a working translation that they qualified as approximately 80% confidence. The letter said, as far as they could tell, something like this: "You kept the record without being asked, the longest and most careful record made by any member of your kind. I noticed when it began. I have been watching it grow. I recognized it as the same practice, different scale, different medium, but the same practice, as what I have been doing from this position for longer than your world has had Kleck's life. I thought, here are people who understand what attention is. Here are people worth speaking to." Elias read the translation 3 times. He folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he wore that jacket every day for the rest of the winter. He did not tell the coordination office this. He did not mention it in any of the meetings. He was not sure why, except that it felt like the kind of thing that belonged, at least for a while, to him and to the room at the top of the stairs, the same way the quiet of the early morning at the instrument belonged to him and to the observation, and to nothing else. It had addressed him. More precisely, it had addressed the archive. Not Elias specifically, not Sergio specifically, but the accumulated unbroken thing they had made together across 67 years. The entity that the archive itself constituted, the record keeper that was not any single person but was the practice sustained by persons, passed from hand to hand, the thread of attention that didn't break. He thought about this for a long time. The question of what Earth would say in return was not one Elias had standing to answer. That was, appropriately, a question for a much larger process involving many more people and many more perspectives than his. He attended some of the meetings. He was asked his opinion on some of the technical aspects of archive maintenance and observational methodology because those aspects were understood to be part of the proposed response architecture. He gave his opinions carefully, with appropriate qualifications about what he knew and what he didn't. What he didn't say in any of these meetings, but thought about alone in the observation room in the early mornings, was this: the entity had not been attracted by the species' military capacity, its resource processing ability, its geopolitical sophistication, or any of the other attributes of civilizational power that tended to dominate assessments of what made humanity significant. It had been attracted by something much smaller: a room, a telescope, a piece of paper, a pencil, the practice of looking carefully, consistently at the same thing for a very long time and writing down what you saw. It had watched the whole noise of human history and found in it a signal. The signal was not the loudest thing. It was not the brightest or the most powerful or the most widely broadcast. It was just the most sustained, the most continuous, the thing that had not stopped. He wondered what Sergio would have made of it. Sergio was 89 years old now, living in a village near Bellinzona, and had been interviewed by approximately every major news organization in the world. Since the initial announcement, he was clear-eyed and precise in every interview, the same qualities that had made him a great observer, and he seemed genuinely, quietly pleased, not at having been proved right about something, because he had never claimed there was anything special in the archive, just that it should be maintained. He was pleased, from what Elias could tell, in the way a craftsman is pleased when the work he made holds up under conditions more demanding than any he imagined when he made it. Elias called him in June. They did not talk often, not because of any coldness, but because they had the kind of relationship that doesn't need maintenance. They had worked in the same room for 2 years and had understood each other's methods and trusted each other's judgment and had rarely needed to say so aloud. I've been thinking about you, Elias said. I imagine you've been thinking about a great many things, Sergio said. His voice was older, slightly slower, but the quality of attention in it was unchanged. The entity specifically cited the length and continuity of the archive, Elias said. The unbroken record. Yes, I read the translation summary. You started it, Elias said. The chain starts with you. Silence on the line for a moment. Not uncomfortable, thoughtful. The chain starts with Max Waldmeyer deciding the weather in Locarno was good, Sergio said finally, and Karl Rapp retiring there and taking up amateur astronomy, and the particular configuration of the Alps that makes the air above the lake stable in the mornings. A great many things preceded me. A pause. But I appreciate what you mean. I wanted to say it, Elias said, to you directly. Another pause. He could picture Sergio at whatever table he sat at, the same quality of stillness he'd had in the observation room, the stillness of someone who is paying attention rather than waiting to speak. How is the instrument? Sergio asked. Perfect, Elias said. Good, Sergio said. That's good. They talked for a while longer about instrument maintenance and the upcoming appointment of a junior observer who would begin her training in the autumn, the beginning of the next succession. After they hung up, Elias sat in the observation room for a while, looking at the drawing he had made that morning. The feature on the solar surface had changed again. Not dramatically, it was a slow change, a subtle reorganization of the concentric ring pattern. The analysis teams had detected a corresponding modulation in the deep structure data. They were working on the interpretation. He drew what he saw, carefully, as always. He noted the subtle shift in the ring geometry, compared it to the previous drawing, wrote a marginal note. Outer ring expansion approximately 2% since previous week. Possible new concentric element forming at approximately 11 o'clock position. He dated it, he logged it, he filed it. He drank the last of the thermos coffee, which had gone cold, and did not mind. The junior observer arrived in September. Her name was Priya Nair. She was 27, trained in astrophysics at ETH Zurich, precise and eager in equal measure. She had applied for the position 3 days after the initial announcement, before the coordination office had even formally posted it, by emailing the observatory directly with a letter that Elias had liked immediately for its refusal to perform enthusiasm. It was just a letter saying she wanted to learn the methodology, was willing to do the work, understood it was a long commitment, and had attached her curriculum vitae as a formality. He had hired her. She arrived on a Tuesday morning at 7 in the dark, half an hour before he expected her. He found her sitting on the stone step outside the observatory door with a thermos of her own, looking up at the stars that were still visible in the pre-dawn sky. She stood when she heard him coming up the path. You're early, he said. I wasn't sure about the public transit schedule, she said, without apology, which he took as a good sign. He unlocked the door and led her up the stairs. He showed her the instrument. He showed her the drawing methodology, the paper circle, the heliographic orientation, the graphite technique. He showed her the logbooks. He showed her the binders. She spent a long time looking at the binders, not pulling them, just standing in front of the wall of them, looking at the 67 years of labeled spines. How do you feel about it? She asked. Not an idle question, a genuine one, the kind you ask when you think the answer matters. About what specifically, he said. About having been the one here, she gestured. Not at anything specific. At the right time, the right person. He thought about this for a moment, looking at the binders. I wasn't the right person, he said. I was the person who was here and kept doing the work. Those are different things. He looked at her. If the person who was here had been someone else, a different astronomer, a different disposition, they might have made the same drawings in the same archive and noticed the same pattern because the pattern was there to be noticed. Or they might not have. We can't know. What I know is that the system that made the noticing possible predated me by decades and will outlast me by at least as long if it's maintained. He paused. Your job, and eventually the job of whoever you train, is to maintain the system. That's it. She nodded slowly. Looked at the binders again. Looked at the drawing board. All right, she said. Show me the calibration procedure. He did. The autumn passed into winter, and the winter into the following spring, with the quiet regularity that had characterized Elias's life at the observatory for 31 years, the regularity that he had once found simply ordinary, and now understood to be a kind of achievement. The observation practice continued. The daily drawings accumulated. The coordination teams in Geneva and Brussels and Palo Alto continued their work on the translation and the response architecture. The world absorbed the fact of the entity in the sun, with the complicated and ongoing mess that characterized how humanity absorbed anything true and large. Arguments about what it meant, discoveries of what it said, adjustments of various frameworks, the slow grinding work of actual understanding. Priya proved to be excellent. She had the quality Elias prized most in an observer. She was more interested in what she actually saw than in what she expected to see. She learned the notation system quickly and adapted it in one small but clever way that Elias recognized as an improvement formally incorporated into the methodology, giving her credit in the log. She asked good questions, accepted the answers when they were good, and pushed back when they weren't, and within 6 months was capable of running the observation entirely independently. He began leaving her alone at the instrument on the clear mornings of her solo shifts. He went on walks during those hours, or drove down to the village, or read, or sat in the courtyard in the early spring sun, and thought about things in a way that was deliberately unproductive, not working the problem, just letting his mind rest on it the way you rest a hand on a warm wall. He thought, on some of those mornings, about the entity's patience. The patience of something that had arrived in a solar system before the third planet had multicellular life and had settled in and waited, not impatiently. The translations, imperfect as they were, conveyed no impatience, no frustrated waiting, no eagerness for a species to hurry up and develop sufficient sophistication to be worth speaking to. What they conveyed was closer to the quality he associated with the old water that lay at the bottom of the lake below, deep, still, capable of anything, simply present in the fact of itself. He tried to imagine being that. He couldn't, really, but he could approximate it. He had been doing the approximation for 31 years, not at any cosmic scale, nothing like it, but in the small daily way of showing up and looking and waiting for the thing to show itself and not being impatient when it didn't. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was why the archive had been noticed, and not the louder things. The fifth communication event happened in November, 3 years after the initial announcement, 2 years after the primary data stream. By then, Priya was conducting a third of the daily observations independently and training a second junior observer, a young man from Zurich named Mark, who had the particular quality of silence that Elias associated with people who were going to be good at this work. The fifth event was different from all the previous ones. The earlier events had been, in the translation team's understanding, a showing, a response and instruction, a transmission, and then the embedded letter. Each had been, in some sense, directed at the totality of the human scientific community, or at least at the instruments and infrastructure of global civilization. The fifth event was smaller, more specific. The heliosismology data showed a localized modulation in the deep structure signature, localized not globally but to a specific surface region. The specific surface region was the same lower right solar quadrant that had contained every previous surface expression of the anomaly, the same quadrant that Elias's drawings had been tracking since 2018. The modulation carried, in the translation team's analysis, a pattern that corresponded to none of the broader communication formats of the previous transmissions. It was more structured, more personal, if that word could apply. After 2 months of analysis, the best interpretation was something like an acknowledgement, a specific acknowledgement of the specific source, of the archive, of the observatory, of the room at the top of the stairs, and the instrument in it, and the drawings on the board, and the binders on the wall. An acknowledgement of a particular kind of person, the kind who shows up every morning. The translation team sent Elias a summary of this interpretation with a note at the bottom that was not strictly part of the official analysis. It was from Anki. It said, I think it's saying thank you for whoever started the record, for whoever kept it, for all of it. He sat with this for several days, not in the sense of being troubled by it, in the sense of not wanting to handle it carelessly. It was a large thing to hold, and he wanted to hold it right. On the fourth day after receiving it, he went upstairs to the observation room in the early morning, before sunrise, when the instrument was still cold and the stars were still out and the dome was dark. He sat in the observer's chair without turning on the lights. He sat in the dark for a while. He thought about all the mornings. All the clear mornings going back to 1989, when he had been 26 and Sergio had been showing him the calibration procedure and the drawing methodology and the notation system, the same things he had recently been showing Priya. He thought about the mornings when the weather was bad, And there was nothing to observe, but he came anyway, because the habit of coming was what maintained the system. He thought about the particular quality of the light when the dome shutter opened and the sun came in, amber in summer, redder in winter, the small seasonal changes he had come to know the way he knew the seasons in the trees below. He thought about the drawing he had made on the morning he noticed the anomaly, the sharp edge that should not exist, the moment he had said, there, to the brass housing of the refractor and meant it in a way he hadn't consciously understood at the time. He thought about the entity, vast, ancient, alone, watching a small blue planet across 150 million kilometers for longer than the planet had complex life, watching it produce fire, and then instruments, and then electromagnetic noise, and then eventually, in a quiet room on a mountainside above a lake, someone paying very close attention for a very long time. He thought about how you would say thank you to something like that, or how something like that would say thank you to you. He thought with exactly this kind of presence. The sun came up above Monte Gambarano at 7:31 that November morning. He heard it before he saw it. The particular shift in the quality of the light through the dome shutter gap, the first gold warming the stone floor of the observation room. He got up. He adjusted the refractor. He placed the paper circle on the drawing board, oriented it to heliographic north, the way Sergio had shown him 33 years ago. He let the sun's image fall onto the paper. The feature was there. The concentric rings precisely defined the razor-sharp edges that should not exist. Steady, patient, immeasurably old, turned toward the third planet. In the lower right quadrant, exactly where it had always been, where it had been building, step by careful step, drawing by drawing, for longer than the record could reach. He picked up his pencil. He began to draw. Outside, the lake below was silver in the morning light, and the almond trees on the slope were bare now with the November cold, and the Alps above were white with early snow. And somewhere below all of that, in the kitchens and the railway stations and the schools and the streets of every town, people were beginning their days the way they always had, with the small habitual gestures of ordinary human life, none of which were small or ordinary in any way that the accumulated weight of history had not made significant. 150 million kilometers away, patient and present, something that had watched the whole of it, the whole long improbable story from the first complex cell to the first fire to the first instrument pointed at the sky, continued to watch. It had been watching for a very long time. It did not appear to be in any hurry. Neither was he. He drew what he saw. He dated it. He logged it. He would file it when he was done. He would be back tomorrow. Mark took his first solo observation in December. Elias was technically present, standing back against the archive wall with his arms folded, watching. But he was not supervising. He had told Mark this at the beginning of the session clearly. I'm not here to correct you. I'm here because I want to watch someone do this for the first time. Mark had nodded once, the way he always acknowledged things, without performance, and had turned to the instrument. He had been excellent, careful in all the ways that mattered, patient in the way that couldn't be taught, which meant Priya had identified the right quality in him when she'd recommended him. He oriented the paper without being told. He opened the shutter the right amount on the first adjustment. When the sun's image fell onto the circle, he sat for a moment, simply looking at it before picking up the pencil, and Elias recognized that pause because it was the pause he made himself, the moment of just looking before drawing, the moment of seeing it fully before reducing it to marks on paper. The feature was there, as it always was now, as it had been every morning. Mark looked at it for a long time, then he drew it. Afterward, when the log entry had been filled in and the drawing filed and the dome shutter closed against the afternoon light, Mark stood at the window, looking down at the lake. He was quiet for a while. He said, "Do you think it can tell when a new person is at the instrument?" Elias had thought about this kind of question before, though not in those specific terms. "I don't know what it can perceive at this distance and in this medium," he said, "but I think the archive can tell, the record can tell. The changed handwriting between Sergio's logbooks and mine is visible to anyone who looks. Yours will be visible in the same way." He paused. Whatever the entity is tracking, if it's tracking the record specifically, which the communication pattern suggests, then yes, in some sense, it will know, not the way you know a person, but the way you know a practice is being continued. Mark nodded slowly. "That seems like enough," he said. Elias looked at him. 24 years old, standing in the observation room that had been his entire professional world for 3 months now, with the easy certainty of someone who had already committed to something and was at peace with the commitment. The archive wall behind him, the drawing board beside him, Outside the window, the lake and the mountain and the particular afternoon light of a December day in Ticino. Yes, Elias said, it is. The full translation of the primary transmission, all 97 interpreted channels, with accompanying analysis and uncertainty assessments, was published the following spring in a form accessible to non-specialist readers. Not a simplification, but a careful scaffolding that allowed someone without specialist training to understand the structure and the main contents if they were willing to read carefully, and at length it ran to 4 volumes. Elias read all 4. It took him the better part of the spring. He read in the evenings and on the rainy days when observation wasn't possible, in the observation room or at the kitchen table while Marta read across from him. What he took from it, in the end, was not the parts that confirmed what had already been widely reported, but the parts that were harder to summarize, the passages about the entities, experience of time, the way the translated text seemed to describe duration as something textured rather than linear, something that had peaks and valleys of density rather than a uniform flow. The passage about the experience of watching the third planet produce its first technological civilization, which the translators rendered as something close to recognition, as if the entity had been watching for something and had, after a very long time, seen it. And the short section near the end of Volume 3 that appeared to be a kind of coda, a summation, which the translators had spent longer arguing over than any other section, because it used structural patterns that didn't map cleanly onto any human grammatical category. The best translation of the coda, the one that appeared in the final published version, was this: there is one practice that does not change. Whatever the size of the instrument, whatever the quality of the medium, whatever the duration of the interval between observations, the practice of someone returning to the same position and looking carefully at the same thing and recording honestly what they see. This is the practice I have kept from this position for longer than the memory of your kind extends. I recognized it when I saw you doing it. I knew then that we were the same kind of thing in the way that matters. Elias set down Volume 3 at this point and sat for a while in the kitchen with the book on the table in front of him. Marta, across the table, did not look up from her own reading. After a moment she said, without looking up, "Is it good?" "Yes," he said. She turned a page. He picked up the book and continued. Spring became summer, and summer became autumn again. And the observation routine continued with its long, quiet, inexhaustible patience, and the world continued to absorb the fact of the entity in the sun with the mixture of wonder and difficulty that characterized how humanity absorbed anything that required the simultaneous revision of multiple fundamental assumptions, and the translation teams continued their work, and the response architecture continued its slow construction, and the succession continued its preparations. Priya and Mark, both now capable of running the full observation independently, the knowledge of the methodology living in 3 sets of hands instead of 1, the chain of continuity lengthened by 2 links. Elias turned 65 in October. He had no particular feelings about this, except the general feeling he associated with getting older in this profession, which was a feeling of having more context rather than more answers, more binders on the wall, more mornings in the archive, more data about the behavior of the subject, and a corresponding deepening of the sense that the subject was never going to be fully described, but only more precisely understood, which was not a loss. Marta made a cake for his birthday. His daughter drove up from Lugano with her husband and their 2 children, who were 7 and 9 and intensely interested in the observatory, in the way children are interested in things that involve large optical instruments and the word alien. He took them up to the observation room in the afternoon, when the sun was in the wrong position for proper observation, but the instrument was available to look at, and the drawings on the board were available to see. They stood at the drawing board and looked at the most recent drawing, the feature in its current configuration, the concentric rings, the sharp-edged geometry that should not exist in a natural solar surface feature. The 9-year-old, whose name was Elsa, looked at it for a while. Then she said, "Is it like a face?" He considered this. "Not exactly," he said. "It's more like a hand raised in greeting, maybe. An announcement of presence, but a face is not a wrong way to see it." He looked at the drawing beside her. "Your great-great-grandfather started drawing things like this before your grandfather was born," he said. "Not this specifically, but the sun, every day. So that eventually, when this appeared, there was a record long enough to recognize it." She thought about this with the focused seriousness of a 9-year-old working through an idea that was larger than her current vocabulary for it. "So he was sending a message back," she said. "Except he didn't know it." Elias looked at the drawing. Something like that, he said. Or maybe he did know, in the way that the monk knows who keeps the vigil even when the question hasn't been answered yet. You keep the practice. You trust that the practice is the right response to the situation, even without knowing what the situation is. And eventually, he gestured at the drawing, at the wall of binders, at everything. Eventually, you find out. Elsa looked at the binders. She looked at the drawing. She looked at him. Can I draw one? She said. He thought about this. Then he found a piece of blank drawing circle paper in the supply drawer and pinned it to the corner of the board and handed her his pencil. The sun isn't in the right position right now, he said, but I can show you what it looked like this morning. He guided her through it, the circle, the quadrant positions, the concentric rings, the particular way you rendered the edge of each ring to show the sharpness. She concentrated fiercely, her tongue slightly at the corner of her mouth, the pencil moving with the careful, deliberate strokes of a child who takes drawing seriously. When she was done, she had made something that was not a technically accurate solar surface drawing, but was clearly recognizable as the feature, the rings, the sharp edges, the quiet, impossible geometry of something announcing itself across an unimaginable distance. She looked at it critically. Is that right? She said. That is right, he said. That's exactly right. She held it out to him. He took it and looked at it for a long moment. Can I keep it? He asked. She thought about this with the weighing seriousness she had apparently inherited from both sides of the family. Yes, she said finally. You can have it. He folded it carefully and put it in the same jacket pocket where he kept the translated letter. He wore that jacket home. He wore it the next morning when he went back up to the observatory for the dawn observation. He wore it for a long time after that, the day before he formally transferred primary observership to Priya. 3 years after she arrived, on a morning in early spring when the air above the lake was steady and clear, and the seeing conditions were perfect, 5 out of 5, Elias made one last solo observation. He was there at 6:45, as he had always been. He unlocked the dome. He opened the shutter. He waited for the sun to clear Monte Gambarogno, which it did at 7:24, a red disk in the morning haze that clarified as it rose. He adjusted the refractor. He placed the paper on the board. He oriented it to heliographic north. He let the sun's image fall onto the paper. The feature was there. It had been there every day. It would presumably be there tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as whoever held this pence continued to show up in the morning and look. He sat for a long time before beginning to draw. Not because he was uncertain or slow, he was neither, but because he wanted to look at it. Just look. The way he had looked at it 33 years ago, when it was not yet this, and he did not yet understand what he was looking at, with the same quality of open attention, the willingness to see whatever was actually there without the interference of expectation or conclusion. The sun on the paper, the feature in the lower right quadrant, the rings within rings, sharp and patient and unmistakably deliberate, the announcement of a presence that had been making itself known across a century of incremental clarification to anyone who was paying attention, carefully enough, and had been patient enough, and had kept the record without interruption long enough to recognize the pattern in the sequence. He picked up the pencil. He drew what he saw, exactly as he always had, every careful line, every tonal gradation, the precise sharpness of the edges, the exact geometry. He worked slowly and without hurry. When he was done, he sat back and looked at what he had made. It was a good drawing, one of his better ones. Clear and precise and honest. A drawing that showed exactly what that sun's surface had looked like on this particular morning, without addition or subtraction, without the observer's preferences or fears or hopes distorting the record. He dated it. He logged it. He noted the seeing conditions. Perfect. 5 out of 5. He filed it. He closed the logbook. He stood up from the observer's chair. He looked at the wall of binders one more time. The full length of it, the full 67 years of it, from Sergio's first observations in 1957 to this morning. He put on his jacket. He went down the stairs. He walked home along the path above the lake in the spring morning, with the almond trees just beginning to bloom on the slope below and the water, catching the light the way it did in early spring, the particular silver blue of it. He had been the person at the instrument for 33 years. Tomorrow, someone else would be at the instrument. The day after, someone else. The practice would continue. The record would grow. The conversation, the slow, multi-generational, impossible conversation between a species that had learned to pay attention and an ancient patient, entity that had been waiting for exactly that, would continue in the only way it could. One morning at a time, one drawing at a time, the long, faithful accumulation of looking. He did not feel finished. He felt continuous, which was, he thought, exactly the right way to feel. Below the hill, Marta was making coffee. The thermos was waiting. He went inside.